How were apocalypse symbols hidden inside art? When people hear the word apocalypse, the first thing that usually comes to mind is fire. Fire falling from the sky. Collapsing cities. Screaming crowds. Darkness. Monsters. The end of everything. But in the history of art, the apocalypse was not always painted so openly. Sometimes it appeared on the stone gate of a church. Sometimes on the small page of a manuscript. Sometimes it was hidden inside a skull placed on a table, an extinguished candle, an empty balance scale, or a tiny painting hanging quietly on a wall. In other words, the apocalypse in art did not always shout. Sometimes it whispered. And maybe that is exactly why it became even more powerful, because artists understood something very early. People do not always read texts, but they do read images, especially when the subject is the end of the world, divine judgment, punishment, demons, beasts, famine, war, and death. A single image can sometimes do more than 100 pages of writing. Much of the visual language of the Christian apocalypse came from the Book of Revelation. The Four Horsemen, the Seven Seals, the Beast, the Dragon, the Last Judgment, the number 666. Over the centuries, these became more than religious elements. They became a visual code of fear, a symbolic language that artists could use again and again. One of the earliest and most powerful places where this language appeared was the church portal in the Middle Ages, because at that time, the doorway of a church was not just an entrance. It was a threshold, a border between the world outside and the promise of salvation inside. Think about a medieval worshiper approaching a cathedral. Before even stepping inside, they would already face a terrifying vision carved in stone. Christ enthroned in glory, angels blowing trumpets, the saved on one side, the damned on the other, the dead rising, bodies trembling, souls being weighed, demons dragging the guilty downward. These images were not just decoration. They were warnings. The message was clear. What you see here is not imagination. It is a preview of what awaits. So even when the apocalypse seemed fully visible in medieval art, it was still hidden in a clever way. It was hidden in architecture, hidden above the entrance, hidden in the moment of passage itself. You did not just walk into a church. You walked beneath judgment. At the same time, the apocalypse was also moving into manuscripts, into hand-painted books, into private devotion, into the imagination of those who held these pages in their hands. In medieval illustrated copies of Revelation, especially the famous Beatus manuscripts from Spain, the end of the world became a sequence of vivid visual scenes. Strange beasts, trumpeting angels, cosmic battles, heavenly visions, towers falling, dragons rising. Suddenly, the apocalypse was no longer only a sermon spoken aloud. It became an image you could turn page by page. That changed everything. The fear of the end was now portable. It could leave the wall and enter the book. It could travel. It could become personal. And once that happened, the visual language of apocalypse became even more intimate. Then came printmaking. And with printmaking, apocalypse could be multiplied, shared, reproduced, spread across cities and homes. This is where Albrecht Dürer becomes so important. His famous image of the Four Horsemen transformed the old scene into something far more violent and immediate. The writers do not look distant. They seem to burst forward. War, famine, death, conquest. They move like a storm. They crush the helpless below them. This was no longer a still religious illustration. It felt cinematic, urgent, alive. Through print, Apocalypse was no longer fixed to one wall or one church. It could circulate. It could enter daily life. The fear of the end could now be reproduced again and again. What had once been a sacred image became a widely shared visual shock. But one of the most fascinating things in art history is that apocalypse symbols did not always remain direct. Over time, artists began to hide them more carefully. Instead of showing fire from heaven, monsters in the clouds, and the final collapse of the earth, they placed the signs of judgment into quieter scenes. A room, a table, a figure standing in thought, a still life, a prayer corner, a beam of light. At first glance, the painting looks peaceful. But then you notice something. A skull, a broken object, a dark painting in the background, a scale, a dying candle, a ruined branch. And suddenly the scene changes. The apocalypse is no longer the subject of the painting. It becomes the conscience of the painting. A great turning point in this story is Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel. Here, Apocalypse is still fully visible. The scene is enormous. Bodies rise. Bodies fall. Christ dominates the center. The saved move upward. The damned are dragged downward. Angels sound their trumpets. Chaos shakes the entire composition. But even here, the symbolism becomes deeply personal. One of the most haunting details is Saint Bartholomew holding his own flayed skin. And many scholars believe the face on that skin is Michelangelo's own. That means the artist did not simply paint judgment as something happening to others. He inserted himself into the scene. He placed himself inside the terror of final reckoning. So the apocalypse becomes more than a cosmic event. It becomes personal guilt, personal fear, personal self-examination. Not just the end of the world, but the exposure of the self. And yet the most subtle hiding of apocalypse happens not in giant frescoes, but in quiet domestic paintings. This is where symbolism becomes truly sophisticated. Take Vermeer's Woman holding a balance. At first glance, it seems calm and refined. A woman stands in soft light. Jewelry lies on the table. The atmosphere is silent and composed. But then you notice the painting behind her. It is a Last Judgment scene. That changes everything. The balance in her hand is no longer just a household object. It becomes a symbol of judgment, of weighing the soul, of moral choice, of eternity measured against earthly wealth. The woman stands between the treasures of this world and the possibility of divine reckoning. There are no flames, no horsemen, no beasts, and yet the entire painting becomes charged with apocalyptic meaning. This is the genius of hidden symbolism. The end of the world is not shown directly. It is folded quietly into daily life. The same is true in Vanitas paintings. These still lifes may look simple at first. A skull, a candle, books, a glass, flowers, a watch, a musical instrument. But each object speaks. Each object warns. The skull says that all flesh ends in death. The extinguished candle says that life can end at any moment. The hourglass says that time is running out. The books say that knowledge fades. Precious objects say that wealth cannot save you. In these paintings, apocalypse is not always the end of the whole world. Sometimes it is your world, your body, your life, your time. That is why Vanitas painting is so powerful. It takes the giant idea of cosmic destruction and reduces it to the space of a table. A few objects become an entire philosophy of ending. In paintings of hermits and saints, this language becomes even richer. A praying figure in a dark interior. A skull nearby. An hourglass. A cross. A dim lamp. A dead tree branch. Maybe a single green shoot emerging from dry wood. All of these are part of the same symbolic grammar. Life is short. Judgment is real. Death is certain. But hope is still possible. Resurrection remains imaginable. This is important because apocalyptic imagery in art is not always only about destruction. It is also about revelation, exposure, transformation, the old world ending. The true order appearing. The false self being stripped away. In that sense, apocalypse in art often means not only doom, but truth uncovered. By this point, we can begin to read the hidden vocabulary of apocalypse. The skull means mortality. The hourglass means irreversible time. The extinguished candle means life or an age coming to an end. The balanced scale suggests judgment. A broken crown can imply fallen power. Ruined architecture can signal collapsing order. A dead or withered tree can suggest a lifeless world. Serpents and dragons often point to chaos, evil, or demonic threat. Storm-darkened skies can imply divine anger or approaching catastrophe. The number 666 functions as coded corruption. The Four Horsemen condense war, conquest, famine, and death into a single terrifying image. Not every artist needs all these symbols at once. Sometimes one is enough, because the viewer completes the rest. As we move into the 18th and 19th centuries, apocalypse imagery begins to change again. It no longer belongs only to church teaching. Artists start using it to interpret their own times. Revolutions, social unrest, political violence, moral collapse, war, cultural anxiety. This is where someone like William Blake becomes essential. In works inspired by revelation, especially the terrifying image of the Great Red Dragon, Blake takes the old biblical monster and transforms it into something psychologically overwhelming. The dragon is still religious, yes, but it also feels like the body of an age in crisis. A giant form of fear. A shape made out of collective anxiety. The symbol remains ancient, but what it expresses feels modern. This is one of the deepest truths about apocalypse in art. The symbol may come from scripture, but it often speaks to the artist's present. And that is why apocalypse symbols survive so well. Because every age believes, in some way, that it is living near an ending. An empire collapses. A plague spreads. A war begins. A moral order breaks apart. A machine changes human life forever. A weapon appears that could erase cities in seconds. Every era finds its own version of the end. And artists return to the symbolic language of apocalypse, because few visual languages are stronger. Dragons, fire, falling structures, judgment, silence after destruction. These images can carry ancient meaning and modern fear at the same time. In the modern world, this symbolic structure often leaves religion entirely and enters political and technological anxiety. Nuclear fear is one of the clearest examples. Suddenly, the apocalypse is no longer only divine punishment. It becomes something humanity can build with its own hands. And modern artists begin showing destruction through media, machinery, radiation, fragmented bodies, toxic symbols, and urban ruin. The old terror remains, but the costume changes. The dragon might become a missile. The trumpet might become a siren. The fire from heaven might become a mushroom cloud. The beast may no longer come from Scripture, but from the systems humans have created themselves. Still, the emotional skeleton remains apocalyptic, a sense that something final is near, a sense that human arrogance has opened the door to catastrophe. So why did artists so often hide these symbols instead of showing everything openly? Because hidden symbols last longer. Overt propaganda ages quickly, but symbols can move across centuries. A church portal in one age, a woodcut in another, a domestic interior after that, a still life, a visionary watercolor, a modern anti-war image. The form changes, but the code survives. Hidden symbolism is flexible. It can be religious, political, personal, philosophical, even psychological. That is why it is so powerful. There's also another reason. Hidden symbolism turns the viewer into a participant. The painting does not tell you everything at once. It asks something from you. It asks you to notice, to return, to look again. The first glance may show beauty. The second glance reveals warning. The third reveals judgment. Once you notice the last judgment behind Vermeer's woman, the entire scene changes. Once you notice the extinguished candle in a Vanitas painting, the atmosphere changes. Once you notice the dragon in Blake not simply as a monster, but as the shape of an age's fear, the image changes. Hidden apocalypse symbols do not only illustrate ideas, they activate the viewer. They make you read the painting like a coded message, and maybe that is why they remain so haunting. Because apocalypse is never only about the future. It is also about the present. It is about the fear that the structures holding life together are fragile. That order can collapse. That time is limited. That wealth is temporary. That power falls. That meaning can be lost. That every human being, no matter how secure, stands under a kind of invisible countdown. The skull on the table is not only death. It is the collapse of illusion. The balance is not only judgment. It is the question of what your life weighs. The dragon is not only evil. It is fear given flesh. So it is not wrong to think of apocalypse symbols in art as a hidden code. Some signs are obvious, like the Four Horsemen. Some are half hidden, like a Last Judgment painting hanging in the background of a quiet room. Some are very subtle, like a dying flame, a broken object, a dead branch, a darkening sky, or a silent skull beside a book. But all of them produce the same underlying message. Order is fragile. Time is short. Judgment is unavoidable. Human life is temporary. And perhaps the most surprising thing is this. Apocalyptic symbols in art do not always produce hopelessness. Yes, they can terrify. Yes, they can warn. Yes, they can show hell, punishment, and collapse. But they can also call people to awaken, to see clearly, to weigh their choices, to remember what matters. In medieval church portals, they warned worshippers before entering sacred space. In domestic paintings, they questioned attachment to wealth. In hermit scenes, they paired death with the possibility of spiritual renewal. In that sense, apocalypse in art often means more than destruction. It means the unveiling of truth. The moment when masks fall. The moment when false value is exposed. The moment when what is eternal stands apart from what was only temporary. That is why these images still speak to us now. When we look at old paintings, prints, frescoes, or drawings, we are not only looking at the fears of the past. We are also seeing our own fears reflected back at us. Fear of war. Fear of collapse. Fear of losing control. Fear of moral decay. Fear of technological ruin. Fear that the world we know is more fragile than it appears. Every age imagines its own ending. Every age transforms that ending into symbols. And every age hides those symbols somewhere, sometimes above a doorway, sometimes on a manuscript page, sometimes in the background of a quiet room, sometimes on a table beside a candle, sometimes in the body of a beast. So the next time you look at an old painting, do not only ask what it shows, ask what it hides. Because in the history of art, the apocalypse was often not placed far away from sight. It was hidden directly in front of us. And maybe that is the most disturbing truth of all. The end of the world was always inside the artwork. We just needed to learn how to read its language.